let's talk about how to find a good translation for books that aren't in English. Expanding our reading habits beyond our own borders is a great way of getting to see the world through someone else's eyes. There have been lots of great international bestsellers lately by authors who are not writing in English. Haruki Murakami, Stieg Larsson, Elena Ferranti, Paulo Coelho, all of these authors and more are selling their books to us in the United States and yet not writing in English. So how do we find good translations? Generally, with these more recent books, we don't have a choice of translations, but when we think about books that are classics that were written not in English originally, sometimes we do have a choice. Then it becomes tricky to figure out which translation should we use. It actually does matter which translation we read. I experienced this myself recently when I read Tolstoy's classic novel, Anna Karenina. I started out reading a copy that we just happened to have on our bookshelf. The translator was Constance Garnett, and she was one of the most well-known translators of this novel. I read it about a third of the way through, and I experienced it as a very smooth read, a kind of typical 19th century novel. Then I happened to be in a used bookstore and I ran across a newer translation by Richard Pevear and Larissa Volokhonsky. The difference was striking. In this newer translation, there was a lot of idiosyncratic phrasing, lots of repeated words and phrases. It read completely differently from Garnett's translation. In the introduction to their translation, Pevear and Volokhonsky quoted Vladimir Nabokov on Tolstoy's style of writing. Nabokov described it as having a rejection of false elegancies and a readiness to admit any robust awkwardness if that is the shortest way to sense. Pevear and Volokhonsky decided not to clean up those passages, but rather to translate them more faithfully to the feel that they have in the original Russian. There are a couple of even more recent translations now. The New York Times Book Review did a piece on them back in December 2014. But the real question is how to choose. So I have a few tips for you on choosing the best translation when you're reading a classic novel that wasn't originally published in English. First of all, don't just pick up the first copy you come across in the bookstore or on your bookshelf at home. The most readily available translations are not always the best ones. Instead, go online and just do a little bit of research. Look up some reviews, look for the most recent translations, and see what the book critics are saying about them. It's worth a half hour of research to pick the right translation that you're going to spend hours reading. Make sure that the version you're getting is unabridged. Sometimes the classics are published in abridged versions that are shorter and easier for readers to get through, but you absolutely want to read this classic in its original form. If you have the opportunity to compare a couple of translations side by side, do that. Open them up and read the first chapters of each translation. Flip through and see how you like the feel of them, the language. Make a choice for yourself about what you find most appealing. It's possible that you may not choose the most faithful translation that way, but often poor translations read poorly. And you want to be able to enjoy your reading of this novel if you're going to spend the time with it. So compare translations and make your own judgment. If you're stuck and you really don't know which translation to choose, a great fallback position is just to go with one of the known publishers. You generally won't go wrong with a translation by Oxford or Penguin. Those are two great publishers' names to look for if you just don't have time to do the research or you're really not even sure how to go about it. Translating anything faithfully from one language into another is a monumental task. The author Haruki Murakami recently translated The Great Gatsby from English into Japanese, and here's what he had to say about translations. Just as dictionaries eventually become outdated, so to some extent does every translation, including, of course, my own, grow obsolete as times change. I would even go so far as to say that when a specific translation is imprinted too deeply in the minds of its readers for too long, it runs the risk of damaging the original. It is therefore imperative that new versions appear periodically in the same way that computer programs are regularly updated. At the very least, this provides a broader spectrum of choices, which can only benefit prospective readers. There's actually a larger problem when it comes to translation, and that is that publishers simply aren't translating books for us into English. What we actually see in the marketplace is the tiniest sliver of books that were written in other languages in other countries and translated for us into English. The best thing we can do as readers, if we care about the international reading community and about being able to read books written in other countries and other languages, is to support those books that have been translated and to purchase them in order to show publishers that we care about those books and we're interested in having more of them. In the meantime, a great place to start with your book club is those classics that have been translated from another language into English for us. I'll leave some links with suggestions for you below, and then you can do a little bit of research and pick out the translation that you think is best for you and your book club. Read on!